Evil Human Experiments. Part 4. This was the Willowbrook State School for Children with Intellectual Disabilities in Staten Island, New York. Yay! And it was home to one of the worst cases of human experimentation ever conducted on American soil. Oh. Originally constructed in 1942 as a United States Army hospital, the facility was quickly converted to a state-sponsored mental institution in 1947 after the World War sequel rolled its credits. But as you can imagine, anything state-sponsored usually turns to shit over time. Well, over the following decades, everything went to shit. Originally designed to house 4,000 students, the school was bursting at the seams as it struggled to contain over 6,000. Poor funding and understaffing led to abhorrent living conditions for the children and young adults who called the facility home. Although the school advertised proper care and treatment for its students, the reality was far different from this facade that they tried to sell. Reporters who visited the school wrote of the horrors within the walls, documenting the absolute filth and neglect that these children were experiencing. Children pointlessly wandered or sat isolated throughout the day, some children locked in rooms for hours on end, and some savagely beaten by their supposed caretakers. No treatments were being administered, no attention given, no attempts at any education whatsoever. Now, this isn't to say that the entire staff was cruel. Some of the nurses did try their best to care for patients using what little resources they had, but like I said, the entire school was critically understaffed, with some single caregivers given responsibility for over 100 children each. There's no feasible way to provide an adequate level of care when you're spread so thin. Any staff who spoke out about this were either silenced or fired. New York state representatives couldn't give a flying flip about the living conditions of those that they deemed parasites on society. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of labor. Now, on top of all of this, the horrendous living conditions of filth and neglect made way for a worse threat: disease. By 1958, nearly 90% of the children at Willowbrook were infected with hepatitis, with most new arrivals contracting it within days. In order to address this, they called in an expert. Dr. Saul Krugman. Hello. He was the leading physician in the study of hepatitis at the time, so understandably, he was the right man for the job. You see, hepatitis had been wreaking havoc across known human history, dating all the way back to the times of the ancient Greeks. The big bearded daddy of medicine himself, Hippocrates, documented outbreak symptoms of fever, liver damage, and yellowing skin, the same symptoms as hepatitis. With the virus having a recent outbreak on American troops during World War II, Krugman wanted to release humanity from its grasp, by any means necessary. And to do that, he needed data. To get that, he needed subjects. The children. Well, they wouldn't be able to consent to such experiments now, would they? The harsh truth is that most of these kids had limited mental function as it was, but there was a little thing called the Declaration of Helsinki that would prove useful. In case you're unaware, after the Nuremberg medical trials where Nazi doctors and nurses were tried for their war crimes, a medical code was developed, the Nuremberg Code. Established in 1947, the code brought forth a set of 10 ethical principles for human experimentation. As we know, human experimentation is a medical necessity. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But there are more ethical approaches that we can take to be respectful of those whom are being experimented on. Things like voluntary informed consent, or the subject's right to withdraw from experimentation if they feel that they are in danger. But just to be clear, the code was not legally binding. It was just a strong set of guidelines. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was proposed, another set of ethical guidelines built from the Nuremberg Code but with a little bit more detail and some slight changes. For Krugman's case, these are the most important. Informed consent could now be granted by legal guardians should the subject be incapable of providing consent themselves. Also, medical providers were given the responsibility to stop experimentation if, in their judgments, the experiments were causing harm.
So how did that last pill make you feel?
Pretty good.
Symptoms have dissolved.
Good. This revised set of codes put Krugman at an advantage, and he was about to activate his trap card. He now had a slew of potential test subjects at his disposal. He just needed their guardian's consent. Krugman then drafted carefully worded letters explaining the research, recruiting parents to send their intellectually disabled children to Willowbrook. Parents were promised that if they gave consent, their children would be given priority to be admitted to newer and cleaner research wards and given experimental vaccines to possibly become immune to hepatitis. They were basically told, hey look, your kid's gonna get hepatitis anyway. Might as well let us test this experimental medicine. Sure, Willowbrook did have a terrible reputation as a care facility. but it was still a care facility and remained the only option for some families. Within a few weeks, Krugman had 700 children volunteered by their desperate parents. Parents who just wanted to give their children a chance at proper care that they couldn't provide themselves. Upon admittance into the school, experiments were conducted in two main phases, one for immunity studies and the other for treatment studies. The immunity group was injected with antibodies and closely monitored to gauge their efficacy. Children simply carried on their day-to-day existence to see if they would still contract the virus. The other group were the unlucky ones. While still given the antibodies, they were deliberately infected with hepatitis. This was either done with direct injection or the drink, a mixture of chocolate milk and infected fecal matter from sick children. Yeah, they really did that. Through experimentation, Krugman learned the amount of the milk needed to cause infection and how long it would take for them to start showing symptoms. Children who managed to recover from the virus were then later reinfected to test for any developed immunities. Krugman looked on as these children suffered, their skin and eyes turning yellow, and them vomiting and refusing to eat. Despite this suffering, Krugman's research was successful. Not only did the experiment drastically speed up the eventual production of a suitable hepatitis vaccine, but helped identify both hepatitis A and B as separate variants. But of course, this didn't stop the criticism. The medical community was completely appalled by Krugman's actions. Although he provided the world with an exceptional discovery and medical progress, he did so while harming his fellow humans, which goes against the medical code of ethics. Paul Offit, a director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, stated that he didn't believe anyone is, quote, ever justified to inoculate a child with an infectious virus that might kill them. Furthermore, famed vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman stated that Krugman's research was, quote, the most unethical medical experiment ever performed on children in the United States. It wasn't until 1972 when Geraldo Rivera, a local investigative reporter, snuck into the Willowbrook school. Inside, he documented the atrociously inhumane living conditions and broadcast them to the world. It was only then did anyone learn the true horrors within the walls. Sure, there were reports in the past, but seeing was believing. Public outcry surrounding unethical experiments like the ones at Willowbrook, as well as the Tuskegee syphilis study, prompted government officials to act. And by 1974, the National Research Act was put into law, requiring any federally funded research involving human subjects to be reviewed and approved by a designated review board. Despite various attempts to refurbish the school, conditions at Willowbrook never improved, leading to its eventual closure in 1987. Krugman, although facing initial backlash for his research, was later praised for his breakthroughs. His past sins were swept under the rug as he became the president of the American Pediatric Society in 1972. He died peacefully several years later in 1995 at the age of 84. It's just tragic to think about the various types of human experimentation used throughout our history. I mean, if you look over here at the— What the? Oh, fuck. Do you know what your life is missing? No, but I bet you're about to tell me. Probably a good desk mat. Ah, there it is. How many nights do you spend awake yearning for something fashionable, comfortable, and durable to grace your desk? Well, your prayers have been answered. These are the first official pieces of chat history merch cooked up by myself and my buddies over at Epic Desk. Each one of these beautiful little babies is a handcrafted work of art. But I don't have a desk at home. Don't have a desk at home? Nope, just said that I didn't. Not to worry, because you can use an Epic Desk mat for other things like having a nice breakfast, playing a nice card game, what a breed! Slapping a nice bug, holding a memorial for a nice bug. I'm so sorry. And so much more. These mats are the definition of quality. I should know. I've owned mine for a few months now, and I know that this is the last desk mat that I'll ever need. My cats love it, so what more proof do you need? You've got Nero fiddling through the fire as well as the flames, the scheming witch and her victim, the hunky honkin' Brit, and my personal favorite, the whole gang with your favorite fella front and center. Epic Desk has a fantastic reputation amongst the creator community, having collaborated with hundreds of talented creators to produce real works of art. So if you want to go ahead and get yourself or a friend your own quality piece of history, use my link in the pinned comment below to get started. Supplies are limited though, so don't dilly-dally too long. Orders are available through October 12th. Once they're gone for good. Must buy desk mat. Yeah, that's right. Canadians are usually seen in a pretty great light, their morality as high as their house prices, but not everything in their history is all sunshine and syrup. Back in 1942, while the world was going to war over in Europe, Canada had itself quite a domestic display of detrimental dread that would cause suffering for over a decade. The Canadian government was making a push to set nutritional standards across the board for all Canadians, setting a baseline for a healthy and nutritious diet so that little lads and ladies could grow up to be formidable fellas and fellettes. It was around this time that breakthroughs in vitamin and mineral isolation were being made, allowing individual supplements to come to market. So, what's this one called? Oh, that's vitamin A. Huh, vitamin A. Neat. Research surrounding the daily recommended intake amounts of such supplements was critical to give proper recommendations for general public consumption. Not only that, but researchers were curious if these supplements could provide additional health benefits outside of just maintaining normal bodily function. In order to test the true advantages of these nutrients, you needed a night and day comparison, both strong and healthy subjects and malnourished ones. Very malnourished ones. Enter Canadian nutritionist and biochemist Lionel Pett. He heard whispers of severe malnutrition amongst various indigenous populations in the Great White North, particularly in the northern region of the province of Manitoba. He brought along a couple buddies. He had Dr. Percy Moore, a medical superintendent in the Department of Indigenous Affairs, as well as famed nutritionist and pediatrician Dr. Frederick Tisdall. Together, the three men set out to investigate the claims. What they found was nothing short of tragic. To say that these people were starving would be an understatement. The level of malnutrition was crippling. Elders were completely bedridden, children had their growth drastically stunted, and even the able-bodied adults were barely able to function. This led the indigenous population to experience dramatically disproportionate death rates, nearly 52 times the rate of tuberculosis deaths, 8 times the national rate of infant mortality, and 5 times the overall death rate. And that wasn't all. Hunger in the state-sponsored boarding schools for the indigenous children was a constant plague. Thanks to intentional underfunding from the Canadian federal government, these schools were incapable of providing decent food for students. Some schools were noted having no refrigeration or appliances, no basic sanitation, or even trained kitchen staff. School children had no choice but to consume food that was practically inedible. Soggy scraps of bread and old water, rancid bits of meat, and rotting vegetables were the norm. Children were estimated to only be consuming around 1,200 calories a day if they were lucky. That's well below even the bare minimum recommended caloric intake of 1,400 calories a day. Approximately 28% of the girls and 70% of the boys were reported as underweight for their age. But instead of bringing these issues, the very obvious root of school-wide malnutrition to light, Pett, Moore, and Tisdall saw these withering children and thought, "Great, there's our test subjects." And so they got to work. Their goals? Study the negative effects of malnutrition itself and if they can be positively offset by nutrient-fortified foods. Together, the three men gathered data points using over 1,000 Indigenous children from several boarding schools across Canada. Blood samples, physical exams, and aptitude tests, all used to establish a baseline across 2 years. 2 grueling years of known malnutrition for the sake of data collection. Imagine doctors coming to your school, seeing you skin and bones, your brown teeth glistening in the incandescent light, and telling you that they're going to help. But in 2 years. Insane. In 1948, Moore and Tisdall began their experimental design. Until Tisdall bit the dust a year later in 1949. He was 55. At the Port Alberni Residential School, students were noticed to have an abnormal riboflavin deficiency as a result of lack of dairy and vegetables. Riboflavin, also known as vitamin B2, helps the body convert food into energy. So the kids were given triple the amount of dairy milk allowance. That's it, just more milk. The Shubenacadie School, crazy name as it is, showed lower measures of ascorbic acid, or vitamin C, in its respective blood sampling. Vitamin C is pretty important for your immune system, helps prevent you from getting all the icky sickies. Half of these students received vitamin C tablets, the other, placebos. Children at the blood school were pretty low in vitamin B1. Also known as thiamine, vitamin B1 plays a vital role in cellular growth and development. They were given a tasty vitamin B fortified flour. Eat up. Similar to Port Alberni, St. Mary's children also lacked riboflavin, but instead of milk, these kiddos were given a fortified flour containing bone meal, which wasn't even legal for sale under Canadian law. Finally, the very unfortunate students at St. Paul de Métis were left with no changes whatsoever. They were the control group. Sorry, guys. Despite the knowledge of the severe lack of quality of nutrition at each and every one of these schools, no additional interventions outside of these supplements were ever made. In fact, many of the staff were actually instructed to withhold any access to dental hygiene for the students, lest it skew their data. None of these children were ever informed that they were being treated as glorified lab rats, nor had any parents ever been told about these experiments. It was all a secret. These experiments lasted for 5 years. 5 years of continued and deliberate malnutrition of children. To no surprise, many died. Even before the experiments, death was prevalent in these schools. And yet, the studies continued, finally concluding in 1953. The results? No breakthroughs, no discoveries, nothing medically valuable that wasn't already known to the healthcare community. Ultimately, the results were inconclusive at best. The suffering was pointless and fruitless. Ashamed of his worthless work, Dr. Percy Moore kept the studies hidden. It wasn't until 2013 when historian Dr. Ian Mosby uncovered the studies and made them public to the world, 60 years after the experiments had ended. Because the research remained hidden for the rest of their lives, both Dr. Pett and Dr. Moore continued to have successful careers, remaining prominent Canadian healthcare figures. Moore died in 1987 from Alzheimer's at the age of 88, and Pett died in 2003 at the age of 93. Probably because he was old as dirt. Harsh criticism came after their work was revealed, sure, but too little, too late. Even in the shadow of a devastating disaster, no one's safe from unethical medical curiosity. On the night of December 3rd, 1984, the city of Bhopal in the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh was in for a rude awakening. A silent death cloud crept across the city, with families abruptly torn from their sleep, aggressively coughing, their eyes inexplicably stinging, and their lungs desperate for fresh air. Within hours, residents fled from their homes to seek refuge, but thousands lay dead in the streets and in their homes. The Bhopal disaster is considered to be one of, if not the, worst industrial accidents in the history of mankind. An accidental release of gaseous methyl isocyanate, a poisonous tearing agent compound, caused the death of nearly 20,000 impoverished Indian civilians, with nearly 2,000 of them being immediate and 8,000 in the following days. This disaster was the result of neglect and underfunding from the Union Carbide Corporation. Various budget cuts to the plant had caused huge gaps in safety and maintenance of chemical production equipment within the facility. Nearly 45 tons of poisonous gas was accidentally released across the city, killing livestock as well as entire families. It's estimated that as many as 500,000 people were directly affected by this disaster. The area surrounding the plant still remains contaminated to this day, even after some half-assed cleaning efforts. Residents living in the area have reported severe health issues years after the incident, many of which being crippling birth defects of those born in the wake of the disaster. As a bit of a band-aid, Union Carbide, the American corporation that owned the plant, paid a modern-day equivalent of $1 billion in compensation in 1989. The Indian government used some of these funds to open the Bhopal Memorial Hospital and Research Center in the late 90s, a hospital which, while open to any needy patient, also provided free medical treatment to any survivors which, at this point, nearly 2 decades later, were in the hundreds. But these survivors would soon be subjected to a new wave of suffering. A caveat made with the construction of the new hospital was that the victims would be studied to determine long-term effects of methyl isocyanate exposure. However, no supporting documentation has ever been found that this research was ever even conducted. Between the years of 2004 and 2008, the hospital was instead commissioned to run several clinical trials funded by various big-name pharmaceutical companies including Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, and Bristol Myers Squibb. Remember, it wasn't just a hospital, it was also a medical research center. It's right there in the name. The participants? 279 hand-picked patients, 215 of which were victims of the Bhopal gas leak with severe chronic conditions. But why pick them? Well, it's been suggested that since these victims were being treated on the government's dime, they were a bit more disposable. These clinical trials focused on testing various drugs and therapies for any adverse effects in humans. These included gastrosurgery, cardiology, psychiatry, and anesthesiology. Participants, if you could really call them that, were given no informed consent on the matter. One survivor who endured the trials was quoted saying, "They didn't tell me anything about the medicine. When they used to give me the medicine bottle, they used to make me sign a form which I had no clue about." In 2011, investigative journalists discovered and compiled the abhorrent trials in a comprehensive report which you can read in my description below if you're interested. Pfizer focused on antibiotic trials which caused terrible adverse effects. GSK sponsored illegal cardiology trials in collaboration with French pharmaceutical company Sanofi-Aventis. Of the 57 patients in their trials, 5 died. There's evidence to support that at least 10 patients died as a result of these various trials. The companies responsible were found to have been in violation of many of the Nuremberg and Declaration of Helsinki principles. For example, any trial-related deaths must be thoroughly investigated and publicly reported in a timely manner. Some of these deaths weren't reported until months or even years later. Now, there was an ethics committee for the trials, which are supposed to be a third-party, non-biased group responsible for overseeing the ethics of the experiment, but get this, 13 of the 19 committee members were doctors performing the trials. Even the freaking ethics committee was unethical. Despite becoming aware of these very obvious and just completely abysmal red flags, the Drug Controller General of India simply sent a warning note to the hospital, which was basically just a big, "Cut it out, mister." In 2013, outspoken activists and court petitions demanded compensation for the victims of the trials, but of course, none were ever distributed. Gotta love corruption. Sit down, strap in, buckle up, clench your cheeks, and put any food down for this one. This is Dr. Leo Stanley, a real sick son bitch. Born in 1886 to a house of learned doctors, Leo grew up to continue his father's legacy. So in 1913, fresh out of school, gripping his medical degree in his sweaty palm and with little to no surgical experience, Leo became the chief surgeon of the San Quentin prison in, you guessed it, San Quentin, California, the state's oldest prison. Leo's first impressions left much to be desired. The prison was cramped and run down with little to no air circulation, no natural light, and the worst offender of all, according to Leo at least, was the lack of racial segregation. In response, he commissioned a new building, one with fresh air, warm light, and people separated by the color of their skin. Although in a position of responsibility as a healer, Stanley made it very clear that he was the one in charge, leveraging medical attention against bad behavior. Accounts from inmates attest to Leo's apathetic approach to their medical needs. Dwight Myers, who had a reputation as more of a rowdy rascal, had suffered a crushed hand while operating a piece of machinery. Myers was rushed to the medical wing and begged Dr. Stanley for help. "Oh fuck, doctor, we need to get him to surgery." "Hell no, slam him on the table right there, get the bone clipper and get to work." And thus, Dwight was minus one hand and plus one infection. Without anesthesia, by the way. Convicted criminal and ironic name haver Steve Krim was also known for causing a ruckus on more than one occasion, having been sentenced to solitary confinement multiple times. On one such an occasion, he complained of an agonizing pain in his groinal ball region. Stanley, who didn't give a fickle flying fuck, refused to see Krim. After 3 months in solitary confinement, Krim suffered a brutal ball blast. His scrotum had ruptured. He was sent off to the hospital wing only to be met with indifference from the good doctor. "Well, it's too late to treat it now. What are you, nuts? Oh wait, you ain't. Get out of here. You sicken me." Reports of abuse and neglect were prevalent across Stanley's career, but what did he care? He was a medical professional and they were no good scumbag criminals. Well, actually, he did care to some degree. He wanted to figure out what made criminals criminals. You see, Stanley was a proud eugenicist. He was extremely vocal in his beliefs that criminals and other lowly humans should not be allowed to reproduce lest they slop out more human filth like themselves. In fact, during his tenure at San Quentin between 1913 and 1951, Dr. Stanley is known to have performed nearly 1,000 sterilizations, both voluntary and involuntary. He felt verily justified in his actions as he believed he prevented the birth of several would-be criminals. But sterilization was just a band-aid. Dr. Stanley wanted to find the source of the problem. While other researchers at the time subscribed to the Lombrosian theory that pointed to physical characteristics as the reason for criminal behavior, Dr. Leo Stanley proposed another theory, that criminality lies within. Quite literally, Stanley sought to prove that some internal parts of the human body were to blame, that they could be studied to find a commonality across known criminals and differentiate those features from productive members of society. To test this theory, he focused on various endocrine glands found within the body. If you're unaware, an endocrine gland is an organ that excretes different hormones in response to your body's needs. These hormones regulate bodily functions like growth, metabolism, and your mood. Your kidneys, your pancreas, your ovaries, your balls, they're all endocrine glands. He began poking, prodding, and even full-on removing glands from prisoners. Did they consent to the surgery? Maybe. Stanley had claimed multiple times the willingness of his prisoners to be put under the knife. But it was later revealed that most of these prisoners had suicidal and homicidal tendencies, so believe what you will. Stanley noted how one troublesome prisoner, who, upon the removal of the majority of his thyroid, experienced a night-and-day personality switch from disorderly degenerate to a calm and collected compatriot, following rules and routines and having his aggressions completely vanish. Stanley drew inspiration from the studies of Charles Brown-Séquard, the manic Mauritian physiologist who injected himself and others with a concoction of blood and animal testicles as a means of rejuvenation and reversing the aging process. You know, from my immortality video, that guy. Despite that research being widely discredited as a bunch of fucking poppycock, Dr. Stanley decided to give it a chance. He conducted multiple experiments involving the removal of testicles of freshly executed prisoners and slapped them bad boys into the sacks of senile old men with the hope of making them less old and certainly less senile. Surprisingly, it worked. Kind of. While it was reported that older men were soon seen bouncing around with the strength and stamina of their younger peers, it was short-lived. Now, his reports also went into copious detail about how long-term flaccid fellas were suddenly pitching tents all over the place and all the implications surrounding that, but yeah, I'm skipping that part. You see, your balls are the main factory of testosterone, the manly hormone. Grows your muscles, your bones, your hair, and makes you want to ram your rod into anything you find remotely attractive. But the supposed benefits of the tender testicle transfer faded very quickly. But that did not stop the experimentation. Over the course of several years, Stanley continued his ball-swapping surgeries, theorizing that if he discovered the proper procedure, he could bring vitality and sanity back to aging men. Stanley thought that this breakthrough would put him on the forefront of modern medicine, that he could single-handedly rid the world of crime. By 1940, Stanley had performed over 10,000 nut jobs, some of which were donations made from animals. Goats, rams, boars, and deer junk were just slammed in men's sacks. Some of these prisoners even received a mixture of mashed up man parts which were injected into their bellies. It wasn't until 1941 that the prison found some solace. Stanley shipped himself off with the US Navy to serve in World War II as a lieutenant commander. And after the war, Stanley returned to San Quentin with extreme disappointment. In his absence, the California Department of Corrections instead opted for clinical psychology to address underlying issues of criminality. Turns out, if you just ask someone why they are the way they are, sometimes that gets the job done. Who would have guessed? With the continued advance of both medical ethics and the study of endocrinology, fellow doctors started calling Stanley out on his bullshit, disregarding his work as utter insanity. Completely demoralized, Dr. Leo Stanley retired from the San Quentin prison in 1951. He opened up a quiet private practice for some years, but then died in 1976 at the age of 90. The brutal ballbuster had no kids. Pretty rough, huh? Want to learn more about evil human experiments, you sicko? Well, I've got a few more videos on the matter. Here's one of them right over here. Oh yeah, remember to subscribe. I'll see you over there.